The metal door groaned on its hinges as it swung open for the first time in 22 years. Daylight cut into the darkness like a blade, and the dust that had settled over everything stirred slowly, rising in pale columns that drifted through the beam of light like smoke. The shape beneath the canvas tarp was unmistakable, low-slung, wide-shouldered, with curves that no amount of time could make ordinary. A BMW M1 prototype, 1979. One of 49 ever built before the production line moved on and left this one behind. Dominic Walsh stood at the threshold, his calloused hands hanging at his sides, and he did not move for a long moment. He knew this car. He knew every bolt, every seam, every particular silence of its neglected engine, because 22 years ago he had been the last man alive to touch it. Behind him, Giselle Hartwell stood with her arms crossed, and one corner of her mouth lifted in a way that was not quite a smile. "If you can make it run," she said, $10 million is yours. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the man standing at the door was the only person on earth who understood exactly why the car had stopped running in the first place. Dominic Walsh was 41 years old, and on the outside, nothing about him suggested anything exceptional. He woke each morning at 5:15 in a small rental house on the east side of Hartford, Connecticut. He made coffee in a machine he had repaired 8 times rather than replaced. He listened for the shuffle of small feet down the hallway, and when his daughter Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway with her stuffed bear tucked under her arm and her hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, something in him settled into place the way an engine settles when the fuel mix is finally right. Violet was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes dark brown, wide, and quietly observant in a way that made adults feel she was listening to more than they were saying. She dropped into her chair at the kitchen table, arranged the bear she called Walnut in front of her cereal bowl, and looked across at her father. "Are you going to be home on time tonight?" "On time," Dominic said. He was standing at the counter, drinking coffee standing up the way he always did. "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday, there was an emergency job. Tonight is different." Violet opened the cereal box and said nothing else, but she set Walnut facing him with a particular directness that needed no words. Outside the window, the oak trees along the sidewalk were already turning. The first good cold of October was moving in from the north, and the leaves were going fast. Dominic had once been considered one of the finest restoration specialists in the northeastern United States. He had spent 3 years in Munich as a young man, apprenticed to a German engineer named Gerhard Wolff, who had worked directly on the BMW M series development program in the 1970s. Gerhard was not a warm man and was not a generous teacher, but he recognized something in Dominic that he had rarely seen: a quality of listening, not just mechanical diagnosis. Something deeper than that. Gerhard had told him once, near the end of the 3 years, "You do not fix cars. You have a conversation with them." Dominic had been 20 years old and had not entirely understood what the old man meant. By the time he was 30, he understood completely. He had returned to the United States at 21 and built a reputation quietly, through referrals rather than advertising. By 28, he had worked on 4 BMW M series vehicles from the 1970s, a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB, and a Jaguar E-Type Roadster that had been sitting in a barn in Vermont for 31 years. He was not famous, but the people who needed to know his name knew it. Then, Sarah died. The pancreatic cancer moved faster than any of the doctors had prepared them for. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Dominic was in the middle of a Porsche 911 restoration contract in Boston when she got the news, and he drove home that evening and never went back. He sold his specialized tools, the ones that had taken years to acquire, and called every client and every contractor, and said he was taking an indefinite leave. He did not expect to return. He had not returned. Not to that version of his life. He worked now at Aaron Mills's garage on a secondary street 12 minutes from the house, doing oil changes and brake jobs and the occasional transmission flush. Aaron was a fair man and did not demand more than the work required, which suited Dominic fine. The salary covered rent, Violet's school fees, and occasionally a new box of wax crayons when the old ones wore down to nothing. Every night after Violet was asleep, Dominic sat in the small workshop space behind the house, not large enough to be a proper garage, barely large enough for a workbench and a stool, and opened the old notebook he kept in the locked drawer. The pages were yellowed and dense with hand-drawn diagrams, technical annotations in both English and German. The traces of a mind that had once been fully alive to its purpose. He never showed the notebook to anyone. He was not sure, some nights, why he still kept it open. He did not yet know that on Tuesday evening, that notebook was about to find its reason. Owen Bradshaw called at 7 in the evening, while Dominic was washing the last of the dinner dishes. Owen was an old friend from vocational school. They had studied automotive mechanics together 20 years ago in the same Connecticut program, and their lives had diverged sharply afterward. Owen had gone corporate, climbing steadily into a senior technician position at Hartwell Automotive Group, one of the largest high-end vehicle distribution and restoration companies in New England. They did not see each other often, but Owen called when it mattered. "Dom, did you see the news this week?" "No." Hartwell opened the storage vault in the main building, sub-basement level. They've had it sealed since 2004. A pause. They found a BMW M1, 1979 prototype, original chassis. The car they locked away. The dish in Dominic's hand went still. "Dom, you know which car I'm talking about. Keep going." Giselle Hartwell, Richard's daughter. She's running the company now. Since Richard passed last year, she called a press conference this morning. Public challenge, notarized contract. Anyone who can restore the car to running condition within 7 days takes home $10 million. Applications close Friday. Dominic sat down at the kitchen table. From the living room, he could hear Violet drawing the soft drag of wax crayon across paper. How many people applied? 47 as of this afternoon. Certified BMW engineers, a restoration team flying in from Stuttgart. The guy who handled the McLaren F1 restoration for a collector in Scottsdale. Owen. "Yeah. Why are you really calling?" A longer pause. "Because I was in that vault today, Dom. I saw the car. And I saw something on the passenger seat under the cracked leather, wedged along the door panel." Owen lowered his voice. "A notebook. Blue cover. I recognized the handwriting on the front." Dominic did not breathe. "It's yours," Owen said quietly. "I didn't tell anyone, but you need to come in." The next morning, Dominic found the press conference footage easily. Giselle Hartwell stood in front of the open vault door in a tailored charcoal suit, camera flashes going off around her like small white explosions. She was 32 years old, with the particular self-assurance of someone who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where people deferred to her. She had a business degree from Wharton, a clean professional record, and no technical credentials of any kind. She spoke fluently about the car's history, the 1979 prototype chassis, her grandfather's acquisition of the vehicle in 1982, and she ended with the challenge, delivered with a smile that made it sound like she was doing the world a favor. Dominic watched the clip to the end, closed his laptop. He stood up, walked to the hook by the back door, and took down his old work jacket. In the right pocket, folded tight, were 3 pages of handwritten notes from a job he had never finished. He put the jacket on and drove to Hartwell Automotive Group. The lobby of the Hartwell building was glass and brushed steel, and the particular kind of silence that expensive air systems produce. The receptionist looked at him, the way receptionists in buildings like this always looked at men who came in wearing flannel and work boots politely, with a careful blankness. "Submitting an application for the restoration challenge," Dominic said. "Company or individual?" "Individual." He waited 40 minutes on a leather chair in the reception area. Around him, other applicants came and went, a group of German engineers in dark suits carrying laptops and diagnostic equipment cases, a California restorer Dominic recognized from a trade magazine cover, 2 university engineering professors who spoke quietly to each other in technical shorthand. Everyone glanced at him once, and then away. Jason Keller found him first. Keller was the head of Hartwell's internal mechanical division, 48 years old, heavy-set, with a silver watch on his wrist that no working mechanic had any business wearing. He had led 3 separate restoration attempts on the M1 over the previous 5 years. All 3 had failed. He had built his professional standing at Hartwell largely on the authority that came from being the man who had gotten closest. He stopped in front of Dominic, and his face shifted into something that was not quite amusement, but was close to it. "Walsh, what are you doing here?" "Submitting an application." Keller looked at the handwritten form in Dominic's hand, and then at Dominic himself, with the expression of a man watching something he finds both confusing and faintly entertaining. You're doing brake jobs for Aaron Mills. You want to tell me what you think you're going to accomplish with a 1979 prototype that my team of 30-year veterans couldn't touch? Dominic did not answer. Giselle Hartwell emerged from the corridor at that moment, Charlotte Reeves behind her with a clipboard. Giselle's eyes moved across the room and settled on Dominic the way they settle on something out of place. "Who are you?" she asked. Direct, without preamble. "Dominic Walsh, here to submit an application." She looked at his form, then at his hands, the calluses, the permanent oil stain under the nails despite being scrubbed clean. "Where are you working currently?" "Mills Garage, Hartford." A brief pause. "That's a community shop," she said. "Yes. You understand the other applicants include a certified BMW engineering team and specialists who've worked Pebble Beach concours vehicles." "I understand." Giselle looked at him for another moment. Then something shifted, from assessment to something that chose to find the situation entertaining rather than worth further analysis. Application accepted. Walsh. She moved past him without breaking stride. "Good luck." Keller clapped a hand on his shoulder as Giselle disappeared around the corner. "Don't waste your week," he said, almost kindly. "That car has been dead for 20 years. Dominic picked up his stamped application form and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "It isn't dead," he said quietly. "It's been sleeping." The year was 2003, and Dominic Walsh was 21 years old and newly returned from Munich when Richard Hartwell first contacted him. Richard was then 60, still lean and sharp, a man who had built his company on a genuine passion for machinery rather than the inherited wealth that came with success. He had in his possession a BMW M1 prototype chassis, number 4301079, one of 49 hand-built vehicles produced by the Bar Coachworks in Stuttgart, before the production version went to the official manufacturing line. Richard had purchased it in 1982 from a private collector in Zurich for $300,000. It had sat in climate-controlled storage for most of that time, driven occasionally, maintained imperfectly, and last run reliably in 1996. Dominic was hired on a 6-month diagnostic and restoration contract. He moved his tools into the Hartwell vault and spent the next 6 weeks learning the car the way Gerhard had taught him completely, patiently, without assumptions. He read every piece of original documentation he could locate. He corresponded with a retired bar engineer in Stuttgart who remembered the prototype program. He took the car apart component by component, cataloging each piece in the blue-covered notebook he carried everywhere. He found the problems, not 1, 3, layered on top of each other, like geological strata. The primary fault was in the Kugelfischer mechanical fuel injection system, a buildup of metallic sediment in the pressure control chamber, the result of an alloy composition BMW had used experimentally in the 1979 prototype run and quietly abandoned afterward because it degraded over time in exactly this way. Every specialist who had examined the car before him had focused on the fuel pump itself. The pump was fine. The pressure chamber was the problem. It was the kind of fault that only revealed itself to someone who understood the difference between what a part was rated to do and what a part was actually doing. The second fault was in the original Bosch ignition control board moisture. Infiltration over decades had degraded the logic circuit in a way that required reprogramming rather than replacement, because the replacement components had not been manufactured since 1993. Swapping in a substitute board would address nothing because the fault was in the logic architecture, not the hardware condition. The third fault was the most obscure and the most consequential, to overlook a microfracture in the engine mount structure, invisible to the naked eye, the result of a manufacturing stress point in that specific prototype chassis that BMW had never publicly documented. Dominic had found it by running his fingertips along the lower left corner of the front mount assembly in total darkness, feeling for the almost imperceptible ridge of a crack that had been there since the car was new. He had documented all 3 findings in the blue notebook, in exhaustive technical detail, every measurement, every material specification, every sequence of disassembly and reassembly required to address each fault correctly. It was the most thorough piece of diagnostic writing he had ever done, driven by a feeling he could not fully articulate at 21, but understood completely at 41, that some work deserves to be recorded as if it matters. Because it does. Then Richard Hartwell had a stroke. The interim management, Richard's eldest son, in place until Giselle came of age to inherit, decided to freeze all non-revenue projects immediately. Dominic's contract was terminated by phone call on a Thursday afternoon. He was told the vault was sealed, and he would not be permitted to return to retrieve personal effects. He received 60% of his contracted fee. No explanation, no notice procedure, no exception. The blue notebook was still in the car. That was 22 years ago. The Friday morning work allocation gave Dominic the 6 to noon slot each day for the contest period, with optional extension to 8 in the evening for the first 2 days. He dropped Violet at the neighbor's house. Eleanor Marsh, 68, retired schoolteacher, the only person in his life outside of Owen, whom he trusted completely with his daughter. Violet stopped at the door and looked back at him. "Is it the car?" she asked. Dominic considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Possibly," he said. She studied him for a moment with Sarah's eyes. "Be careful," she said, and went inside. He arrived at the vault before 6 on Saturday morning. The security guard checked his badge, logged the entry time, and returned to his coffee. Dominic stepped into the cool dark of the storage space, set up his portable work light, and stood for a moment looking at the BMW M1 in the pool of yellow illumination. The canvas tarp had been removed for the applicant viewing the day before, and the car sat exposed paint, dulled to a flat gray-silver by 2 decades of darkness, tires completely deflated, the windshield filmed with a fine layer of particulate that had settled over years like the finest possible snow. But the shape remained everything Gerhard had said it was, low and wide, with the Giugiaro Bodyworks characteristic wedge profile, the distinctive side air intakes, the glass that angled forward in a way that made the car look perpetually in motion, even standing still. It was not beautiful the way new things are beautiful. It was beautiful the way old true things are beautiful, the kind of beauty that has been tested by time and not diminished by it. Dominic went to the passenger door. The hinge was dry. He lifted and pulled simultaneously to avoid stressing the pin and reached in beneath the cracked leather of the seat bolster. His fingers closed around the blue notebook. He pulled it out. Dust fell from the cover in a thin cascade. He opened to the first page. BMW M1 Prototype Chassis 4301079. Preliminary Diagnosis. Walsh, D. November 2003. His own handwriting, 22 years younger, looked back at him from the page. He set the notebook down on the workbench, opened to the diagnostic section, and began. The first and second days were entirely disassembly and verification. No repairs, no replacements. He was checking every finding in the notebook against the current state of the car, accounting for additional deterioration over time. The 3 primary faults were exactly as he had recorded them. There were secondary issues that had developed in the intervening years. Dried rubber seals throughout the fuel system, minor oxidation on several electrical connections in the engine bay, a fuel tank that had gone completely dry and would need internal cleaning before use. He cataloged everything onto fresh paper, placed parts orders through Owen from a specialized BMW classic supplier in Pennsylvania and a vintage components dealer in Nuremberg, and planned his work sequence for the days ahead. On the second evening, Giselle came to the vault. Dominic was lying under the car with a flashlight clenched between his teeth when he heard her footsteps on the concrete. "Progress, Walsh?" "Moving forward," he said from underneath. A pause. Her heels had stopped. "The German team disassembled the entire fuel system today. They've sourced original specification components from Nuremberg." Dominic did not respond. "I'm telling you this," Giselle continued, in a tone calibrated to sound informational rather than pointed, "because your probability of completion is statistically the lowest in the applicant pool. Nothing personal." He rolled out from under the car, sat up on the concrete, and looked at her. His face was entirely even. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then walked back toward the door. He watched her go, then returned to work. The third day began badly. He arrived at 6 to find his tool bag had been moved. Nothing taken, but the placement was wrong. More critically, the custom pressure measurement device he had brought from home, a tool he had built over 2 weeks specifically for checking the Kugelfischer pressure chamber, without full disassembly, had been taken apart and reassembled, incorrectly. The calibration was off. Someone had been in his workspace. Owen appeared at 8, visibly tense. Jason Keller had signed into the vault the previous evening, under the pretense of retrieving forgotten equipment. He had no equipment stored in the vault. "Do you want to file a report with Charlotte?" Owen asked. "No. Dom. The damage is minor. I can recalibrate in 40 minutes. Filing takes longer than that and costs me time I don't have." Owen watched his friend work. He had known Dominic for 20 years, and he recognized the particular quality of stillness in that face, not patience, in the way people describe patience. The total elimination of everything that was not the task directly in front of him. The real crisis on day 3 was not Keller. It was the parts. The specialized components ordered from Germany were held at customs for an additional 24 hours. The Kugelfischer pressure chamber insert the central piece of the primary repair sequence was not arriving until Monday morning. Without it, the primary fault could not be addressed, and without addressing the primary fault first, the entire work sequence Dominic had planned collapsed. He called Aaron. "I need 606 1T6 aluminum sheet, 3 mm thickness, and access to a CNC lathe. Who do you know?" Aaron was quiet for a beat. "Sam Whitfield on Trumbull Street. He's closing the shop, selling the equipment. You'll have to talk him into it yourself." Samuel Whitfield was 70 years old and had been a precision machinist for 40 of those years. He did not know about the BMW and did not care about the $10 million. But when Dominic described the dimensional specifications of the component he needed, fabricated, speaking in exact terms of tolerances and surface finishes and alloy behavior at operating temperature, Samuel listened all the way through without once interrupting. At the end, he said, "Come this afternoon." Dominic left the vault at 11, drove to Trumbull Street, and stood next to Samuel's CNC lathe for 4 hours, directing the fabrication of a replacement pressure chamber insert, accurate to within 0.02 of an inch. He returned to the vault after 6, with the component wrapped in clean cloth in his jacket pocket. The 4th day was the one Dominic had both anticipated and dreaded, because it required addressing the microfracture in the engine mount, and the contest rules had prohibited specialized diagnostic hardware in the interest of equal conditions among applicants. He did not need an ultrasonic scanner. He knew exactly where the fracture was, 22 millimeters below the second mounting bolt on the lower left corner of the forward mount assembly, running longitudinally for approximately 8 millimeters. He reached in and found it with his fingertip the same way he had found it in 2003 by feel. In the dark, running the pad of his index finger along the metal surface until the almost imperceptible ridge of the fracture line registered against his skin. It was unchanged. A structural crack of that nature either propagates under load or remains stable in storage. This one had stayed stable for 22 years, waiting. He did not weld it. Welding would introduce heat stress to the surrounding alloy in a way that compounded the original problem. Instead, he used a cold bond reinforcement technique, metal compound epoxy, applied in sequence with a precisely cut aluminum backing plate, held under pressure from a clamp he fashioned from bench materials, while the epoxy cured. Gerhard had taught him this approach for components that could not be removed for conventional repair. Done correctly, it was structurally superior to a weld in exactly this kind of application. Violet called at 11 in the morning while he was waiting for the first layer to cure. He set down the brush and answered. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Fine. Are you okay?" "Yes." A pause with the particular weight of a child working up to something. "Mrs. Marsh told me you used to fix really special cars. She said you were the best, and you just didn't know it." Dominic looked up at the BMW M1's engine bay opened and exposed in the work light's pool of yellow. Every component accessible and waiting, the exposed machine had a kind of honesty to it that closed, finished things never had. "She's a generous woman," he said. "Bah." She used the Vietnamese word for father, a habit inherited from Sarah, who had used it with her own parents. "Do you think about Mom when you're working?" The question arrived like a change in pressure. "Yes," he said. "Me too," Violet said quietly. "I think she wants you to finish the car." He stood still for a long moment. "I'll finish it," he said. "Sleep well tonight." He ended the call and stood with his hand on the phone. Then he picked up the brush and continued. Charlotte Reeves came to the vault that evening, alone, without the clipboard she usually carried. She stood at the entrance briefly before speaking. "I've been reviewing the company archives," she said. 2003 you were brought in by Richard Hartwell on a 6-month diagnostic and restoration contract for this vehicle. The contract was terminated after 3.5 months when Richard suffered his stroke. The company paid 60% of the contracted amount with no formal notice procedure and no documented justification for the termination. Dominic set down his torque wrench. The remaining 40%, with standard contractual interest compounded over 22 years, amounts to $460,000, Charlotte continued. That's a separate liability from the contest prize. The company owes it regardless of how this week ends. I didn't come here for a lawsuit, Dominic said. I know. I'm telling you because you should know what's owed to you. He looked at her. What made you look it up? Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Because I watched you work in here for 3 days, and you don't work like someone who came for the prize. She set her clipboard down against the wall. You work like someone who came to finish something. After she left, Dominic turned back to the engine bay and stood in the silence for a long time. There are things a person starts and does not finish. Not for lack of skill or will, but because life moves in directions that were not planned, and some projects get sealed behind closed doors, along with everything else that couldn't be taken when leaving in a hurry. Those things do not disappear. They wait, the way unresolved things always wait, at the edge of a person's awareness, occupying a space that nothing else can quite fill. He had been carrying the weight of this unfinished thing for 22 years without naming it as such. Standing in the vault now, with the car open in front of him, and the tools laid out in order, and the notebook pages turned to the right section, he understood that the $10 million was not the reason he had come. It was a consequence. The reason was simpler and more difficult to explain. Some work deserves to be finished by the right hands, and he was the only pair available. He picked up the wrench. The 5th day was the last full working day before demonstrations. Dominic was at the kitchen table at 4 a.m, with the remaining task list in front of him. 5 items. The German parts had arrived Monday afternoon as promised. Everything was staged and ready. He had 9 hours of scheduled vault access. He wrote the estimated time for each item in the margin. Added the numbers twice to be certain. It was achievable. Barely. If nothing else went wrong, he arrived at 6. Keller arrived at 7. The vault was large enough that they never needed to share space, but Keller did not go to his own station immediately. He stopped partway across the floor and stood looking at what the BMW had become over 4 days of Dominic's work. The engine bay was fully reassembled. The fuel system was complete. Kugelfischer unit cleaned. Pressure chamber replaced with the machined insert from Samuel's shop. All lines reconnected in correct sequence, with new sealing compound at every joint. The ignition wiring harness had been cleaned and rerouted where oxidation had stiffened it. The engine mount reinforcement had cured solid. The fuel tank had been cleaned internally and refilled. Both front tires had been properly inflated, as had the rear. From the outside, the car did not look transformed. The paint was still aged and flat. The body still wore the character of decades undisturbed. But to anyone who could read what was under the hood and beneath the chassis, the message was unambiguous. You reinstalled the original pump, Keller said. It didn't need replacing, but the chamber was blocked. Metallic sediment in the pressure regulation passage. I machined a new insert for the intake side. Clean passage, original pump, original function. Dominic did not look up from his work. Keller was quiet. He leaned in slightly, looking at the Kugelfischer assembly, studying the configuration of the reinstalled components with the focused attention of a man who had tried and failed to solve the same puzzle and is now seeing, for the first time, that he had been looking in the wrong place all along. You've known this car before, he said. Not a question. A conclusion. Dominic reached for the torque wrench. Keller stood for another long moment, then walked to his own station in silence. The hardest task of the morning, the one Dominic had allocated the most time for, was the ignition board reprogramming. There was no software for this. The original Bosch control board from 1979 was not in any current database, had not been supported for decades, and the logic architecture it used predated every modern diagnostic interface by a significant margin. The German engineering team had planned to source a compatible replacement board. Dominic had chosen a fundamentally different approach. In the blue notebook, on pages 41 through 48, he had recorded the complete logic map of the original board, measured point by point with a multimeter over 6 hours in November of 2003, transcribed in his own notation system. Because no standard documentation existed, it was the most precise piece of technical work he had ever done, and he had done it with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood, even then, that this information might one day matter in ways he could not predict. He opened the notebook to page 41. The reprogramming took 2 hours and 18 minutes. One incorrect reading, one transposed connection, and the sequence would fail, with no time remaining to diagnose and correct it. He worked in complete silence. No music, no checking the clock, just the board, the notebook, and his hands moving through the steps in the exact order he had written them 22 years ago by the light of a work lamp in a sealed vault. At 4:13 in the afternoon, he reconnected the board to the main circuit and applied power. The dashboard warning indicators came on in sequence 1, 2, 3, each illuminating in the correct order according to the original system startup logic. Then, one by one, they went dark. System nominal. Dominic set down his testing lead and sat completely still for a moment. Owen arrived at 5. He stood at the edge of the work area, looking at the reassembled engine, the clean bay, the orderly routing of reconnected wiring. He did not speak immediately. "Dom," he said finally, "you actually did it." "Not yet," Dominic said. "One step left." Owen looked at him. "What step?" Dominic met his eyes. "Starting it. Violet called at 6 that evening. Are you almost done?" "Almost. Are you going to win?" Dominic looked at the BMW M1 standing under the work light. The paint was still aged. The body was still what time had made it. But inside he knew with the certainty that only comes from having put every component back with his own hands, in the right order, for the right reasons. Everything was ready. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I did everything I could do." A brief pause on her end. "That's enough then," Violet said. "Mrs. Marsh always says that's enough." He smiled, the first genuine one, in 5 days. "I'll be home before 8, he said. "Set Walnut at my place for dinner." The demonstration was scheduled for 10 in the morning on Friday. The vault's large roll door had been opened to the loading bay area outside, where the concrete apron gave enough clearance for vehicles to be brought out and assessed by the judging panel. Giselle Hartwell stood with the 5-member panel: Charlotte, 2 company legal representatives, an independent mechanical adjudicator hired specifically for the occasion, and a videographer retained to document the proceedings in full. The morning proceeded through the other applicants in scheduled order. The German engineering team had requested a 3-day extension to complete their parts sourcing. The request had been denied per the original contest terms. They withdrew. The California specialist managed to start his vehicle. The engine caught and ran, rough and uneven, for 17 seconds before an irregular combustion noise prompted him to cut power. A second attempt produced no response. He withdrew. 3 remaining applicants did not reach the demonstration threshold. Their vehicles either failed to start or triggered protective shutdown within the first few seconds of running. Jason Keller went fourth. He had worked with a 2-person team for all 7 days, and his preparation had been extensive. The BMW he had been working on started the engine, caught and ran, rough but sustained, for 42 seconds before the thermal management warning system cut power and held. The panel noted the time in their records. Keller stood with his hands in his pockets and stared at the ground. Dominic was last. He rolled the M1 out to the apron. By hand, contest protocol required all vehicles to be pushed to the demonstration area to prevent safety issues in enclosed storage. Sunlight reached the car for the first time in 22 years. In direct light, the aged paint had a particular quality, flat and honest, carrying its history without apology. The low profile of the Giugiaro body, the angled windshield, the long, clean line of the sill, none of it had diminished. Time had not reduced the car. It had given it a different kind of presence, the presence of something that had survived without compromise. Giselle stepped forward to look at the engine bay, which Dominic had opened before rolling the car out. She stood looking at the assembly for a moment in silence. Then her eyes moved to the passenger seat, where the blue notebook lay open to the diagnostic pages. Charlotte, standing a step behind, followed her gaze and then looked at Dominic. "Walsh," Giselle said quietly. "That notebook, mine," Dominic said. "I left it in the car in 2003. The last time I was in this building, the loaded bay went completely still." Giselle looked at him, not with the carefully managed register she had maintained throughout the week, not with the half-smile that had been her default posture in every exchange since Monday. She looked at him with the expression of someone performing a real-time reassessment of an evaluation she had believed was finished. The independent adjudicator stepped forward. "Mr. Walsh, you may begin when ready." Dominic opened the driver's door. The hinge moved smoothly. He had lubricated every hinge on the car on day 2. He lowered himself into the seat and adjusted the backrest and sat for a moment in the narrow cockpit. The smell was 22 years of leather and dust and old rubber, with something underneath that was purely mechanical, the specific mineral presence of a precision engine that had not yet run but was ready to. It was a smell he recognized from Munich, from every dark workshop where something important waited for the right moment. He checked the gauges, positioned his hands on the wheel. He exhaled, slowly and evenly. He turned the key. For the first 10 seconds, there was only the turning of the starter motor, the mechanical effort of a system waking from a very long stillness, pistons beginning to move, the Kugelfischer pump building pressure in the fuel lines for the first time in over 2 decades. The sound was deliberate and patient, the sound of something very old reminding itself what it knew how to do. Then the engine caught. It did not sputter, it did not labor. It came up from silence to a deep, even idle in the space of 2 seconds, a sound that was, in the precise way Gerhard had described it 40 years ago, more like music than machinery. A low, sustained, perfectly measured note from a 4-liter straight 6 that had been waiting 22 years for someone to give it the correct reason to run. No one in the loading bay moved. The temperature gauge climbed from cold through warm and settled at the correct operating range, with a steadiness that suggested nothing in the system was struggling. No warning lights on the panel. No combustion irregularities in the engine note. No protective shutdown. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. Dominic switched off the engine, opened the door, and stepped out. He stood beside the car in the October sunlight and said nothing. Giselle Hartwell was looking at him. For the first time all week, she had nothing to organize on her face. The conference room on the 14th floor was quiet that afternoon. Charlotte placed the contract on the table, $10 million. Notarized, consistent in every detail with the public terms Giselle had announced at the start of the week. Dominic looked at the document for a moment. The number resolved into specific shapes, a real home for Violet, one with a yard and a room with morning light. Violet in any school she chose. A proper workshop with the specialized tools he had sold 4 years ago, and the ones he had never yet been able to buy. He set down the pen without signing. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. Giselle waited. "Do you know why the car was sealed for 22 years? She was quiet. Not because the damage was irreparable, not because no qualified person existed. The Interim Management Board decided in 2004 that restoring a one-of-a-kind prototype with no standard production application was not worth the investment. He looked at her steadily. A prototype chassis like this one original, matching numbers, with documented development provenance at current international auction values, it was worth between $8 and $10 million before I touched it. Running and certified, it's worth considerably more than that. You didn't announce this challenge because you genuinely believed no one could complete it. You announced it because you believed no one could complete it within 7 days without an unlimited budget and direct factory support. The room held still. Giselle did not look away from him. "You're correct," she said. "That was my reasoning. And now?" She let out a slow breath, the first genuinely unguarded thing he had seen from her in a week. "And now, I owe you $10 million. Dominic picked up the pen and signed. After the contract was complete, Charlotte set a second folder on the table, the outstanding balance from your 2003 contract, with standard interest applied over 22 years, totals $460,000. The company will issue a separate settlement payment. Dominic looked at her. "You didn't have to do that. The obligation existed before this week," Charlotte said. "It should have been addressed before this week." Giselle folded her hands on the table. "I also want to say what I told you in the lobby on Thursday, about your probability of success being the lowest in the applicant pool. I was dismissive in a way that wasn't warranted." A pause. "I apologize." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know what you didn't know," he said. "That's different from bad faith." He left the Hartwell building at 4 and drove directly to Eleanor Marsh's house. Violet came running out before he reached the porch, walnut under her arm and blue crayon still on her cheek from whatever she had been working on. She stopped when she saw his face and tilted her head slightly. "Done?" she asked. "Done. Did the car run?" He crouched down to her level. "Yes," he said. The car ran. She put both arms around his neck and held on for a moment. Walnut pressed between them, and Dominic closed his eyes. He thought about Sarah, about the last clear afternoon in the hospital when she had held his hand and told him not to abandon the work, permanently give it up for Violet. Yes, for as long as Violet needed it, but not forever. He thought about the blue notebook and the 6 hours he had spent in a cold vault in November, mapping an ignition board point by hand, because something in him had understood, even at 21, that precision is a form of respect. He thought about Gerhard Wolf's voice saying you have a conversation with it, and how the conversation with this particular machine had taken 22 years to conclude. He stood up, took Violet's hand, and walked to the car. He spent the first 3 days of the following week finishing 2 jobs at Aaron's garage that had been waiting since before any of this began. On the last day, Aaron shook his hand and held it for a moment without saying much. That was the right amount. Owen called that evening with a development. The German engineering team had reached out to Hartwell about a research collaboration. They had specifically asked about the Bosch board reprogramming method and believed the approach could potentially be applied to at least 9 other unrestorable BMW classics held in private collections across Europe. Dominic said he would think about it. Giselle called Saturday afternoon from her personal number. "I want to offer you a long-term consulting arrangement with the group. Flexible schedule, your choice of projects, no office requirements." A pause with a different quality than her usual ones. "I also want you to know the Stuttgart team asked about your training background. You studied under Gerhard Wolf, 3 years. He's considered one of 4 or 5 people in the world who understood the M-Series development program from the inside. Most specialists in this field have never encountered his name. Most specialists in this field wouldn't have needed to," Dominic said. "Send the contract terms through Charlotte. I'll look at them. Walsh." She stopped, then resumed differently. "The Stuttgart team asked what you call your restoration methodology. They want to document it for their archive." He looked out the kitchen window. From the living room came the sound of Violet humming to herself, a habit she had inherited from Sarah, who had hummed without ever seeming to notice she was doing it. "It doesn't have a name," Dominic said. "It's just doing things in the right order." A silence on her end. Then, "That might be the most accurate description of genuine expertise I've ever heard." After the call, Dominic sat at the kitchen table for a while, without moving. He had not made many decisions yet about what the money would become. There was time for that, and he had learned over years that decisions made slowly and carefully tend to hold better than decisions made in the immediate brightness of change. But he had already made one, quietly, on the drive home from Hartwell the previous Friday afternoon. He was going to open a workshop. Nothing large, nothing designed for volume. A proper space with a lift, the right tools, and enough room to work on one vehicle at a time with the full attention it deserved. He already had a list held in memory, not yet written down, of 7 vehicles he knew existed in private storage across the country. Engines gone silent, histories left incomplete, machines sitting in the dark waiting for someone patient enough and knowledgeable enough to show up and listen. He went to the small workshop behind the house after Violet was asleep. He sat on the stool and placed the blue notebook open on the bench under the worklight. The last used page held his final notes from 2003, the handwriting of a younger man at the end of a job that had been interrupted before it was done. He uncapped his pen, turned past it to the first blank page, wrote the date at the top in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who understood that documentation is itself a form of care, a way of saying that what comes next matters, that it is worth recording, that it is worth doing right, and began.